Hi, I'm Femi OK. You are watching the stream. As a journalist, myself and most of my colleagues try really hard not to be the story, just to tell the story. But what happens when you're a Black journalist and you're covering issues about race and racism? We asked on the stream some Black journalists around the United States what it has been like covering the George Floyd protests. And this is what they told us.
Being a Black journalist in general is draining, but especially when you're working in a predominantly white newsroom. On any given day, you have to ask yourself questions like, can I write about yet another lynching of a Black man and risk breaking down in my office with no one who looks like me to turn to? Or do I feel comfortable with letting a non-Black reporter take this story, knowing that they might miss some of the critical nuances of the situation?
We've been trying to cover the racial health disparities, the systemic racism, the policy violence, all these things that have factored into the moment we're experiencing right now. So on one hand, it's nice that Black journalists finally have the floor in a white-dominated industry. On the other, you have to wonder why it takes Black pain and Black trauma to become a trending topic for Black journalists to be valued.
One of the perspectives of covering this protest, this historic moment as a person of color, is that the change that people are seeing in these protests is the understanding by Americans who are not subject to racism and not subject to police violence, that this is everybody's problem to solve. This is no longer a Black problem.
Thank you to all those journalists who helped us start off this program. I know you have opinions as well. We are streaming on YouTube. Jump into the chat and you can be part of this conversation too. Let's meet the panel. I'm going to say hello to them and they will introduce themselves to you. Hello, Soledad.
Hi there, Soledad O'Brien, journalist. This is my 31st year as a reporter and anchor, mostly in broadcast and cable, and been covering documentaries and breaking news stories, often involving race for many of those years.
Thanks, Soledad, for joining us. Hello there, Patrice. Good to have you on the stream. Tell everybody who you are.
Hey everyone, my name is Patrice Peck. I'm a freelance journalist. I've been a journalist for about 11 years now. And I really just cover stories for and about the Black community throughout the diaspora.
Hi there, Quincy.
Hi, I'm Quincy Walters. I'm a reporter at WBUR, Boston's NPR news station. I've been covering stories about identity pretty much since I've started in journalism 5 years ago.
Welcome, everybody. I'm going to start off here on my laptop with one of Quincy's stories. Here's the headline. I'm in a perpetual state of anger. Hundreds in Boston protest George Floyd's death. What has it been like being out there in the protests for you, Quincy?
It's been sort of a range of emotions. I think the first one being concern over, we are in the midst of a deadly pandemic. That was sort of my first concern. My second concern is that, the impetus for these protests is because of police brutalizing Black people. And, I'm going out into the world as a Black person and at this protest, and sort of how can I ensure that it's known that I am a journalist, but as we've seen in recent weeks, being a journalist does not make you immune to being harassed by police. And also sort of just being able to capture the moment and speak to people and sort of share why they're out there, especially during this pandemic, but also, answering some questions that, folks in the newsroom might have who are not Black. So it's sort of a confluence of...
What questions did the newsroom ask you?
So it's sort of like, in news meetings where we're kind of thinking about ideas, it's like, Quincy, what does this sound like? I know, for instance, this past week I had to kind of It seemed like a story was forming about maybe doing a profile of a cop who kneeled, who also went viral for singing a few years ago. And I said we cannot have a headline story that's singing cop takes a knee. That's not what protesters are asking for. So sort of things like that.
All right, so you're kind of steering them in a direction where you felt this is a better context to maybe approach this story. Soledad, I can't even imagine how many times there have been incidences of police violence, of people of color being at the end of that police violence. So when you saw George Floyd on the ground, you heard about his death. What went through your mind as somebody who covers race and culture and has done so for 3 decades?
I think it felt a little bit different. And I think the question is, does this difference remain? Clearly, we were in this window. We had Ahmaud Arbery, we had Amy Cooper here in New York City, and Chris Cooper, no relation, the birder, the handsome birder in Central Park, and all of those stories. And of course, we had George Floyd. And I think all of those stories caught on camera really captured a different point of view about race in America, and kind of one right after the other. And I think it was the combination of all of them, and then 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd that made people, all people, a lot of people, different people, not just Black people, recognize like, wow, this has hit some kind of a boiling point. So I think there is something that feels a little bit different. It's interesting, you know, when you cover these stories, and there have been so many for a really long time, I hate to use the word traumatizing because that almost sounds too dramatic, but it's exhausting. And it's like an assault. I mean, some days you think like, do I post this? Do I re-up it so people can see the detail of what's happening? Or do I just feel like I'm adding to the void of negativity and really, something that's going to really stress people out and make them more anxious? And so that's a debate that I just have personally. And also, I think in newsrooms, how do you sit there and say, what are the stories that we should be covering? Do we cover this and not cover that? What's our point of view on it? Who's a voice that we're going to elevate? Whose voice are we leaving out of this conversation? So I very much admire Quincy because it sounds like he has a lot of restraint and patience when he has to say to people like, no, this is not going to be the story. This is maybe help me help you. But, sometimes doing the help me help you is freaking exhausting. It's tiring. I think it's really tiring.
Patrice, I've got to pull you in here. This is an op-ed that you wrote for the New York Times. Now, a lot of Black journalists are sharing. They're sharing their angst, their pain, their experience of covering race right now. Here's your op-ed. Black journalists are exhausted, but we keep on keeping on. Patrice, that is you keep on keeping on. Describe, break down the exhaustion. I'm guessing it's not because you're not getting a full 8 hours of sleep. It's beyond that. Unpack it.
Yeah, it's definitely beyond that. It's all the things Quincy and Soledad have been saying. It's, first of all, you have the pressure that comes with journalism, regardless of your race. Today, the news cycle is 24/7 because of the internet and social media. Publications are still companies. At the end of the day, they need to make money, and so therefore they need to push out constant, nonstop flow of information, right? And who's producing that information? Journalists. So on top of that, you have Black journalists. Mind you, we are in the midst of two pandemics. The coronavirus pandemic is still happening. Black people in the United States and the UK, as well as some other nations, are still being disproportionately impacted by this disease. And then we also have the pandemic of white supremacy and systemic racism, which has been going on since Black people were brought over here. And, inside of that, Black journalists, we are not in a vacuum. We are also people, right? And so there are so many Black journalists who either know someone personally or indirectly who has contracted and or died from the coronavirus. We know someone who's an essential worker. 75% of essential workers in at least New York are people of color. My mother is a nurse, right? And then again, it goes back to what Soledad was saying, and what I mentioned in my essay, sort of like a day to day and sometimes hour to hour news releasing of another Black person that has died or has been brutally assaulted or killed by a police officer or a vigilante. So it is nonstop. And while as journalists we are objective and we are able to separate, our personal self from our professional self, we still have feelings. Things are still exhausting. Things are still frustrating. And me personally, I still get angry. And I want to sort of parallel this to essential workers, right? So I have a newsletter that I launched on April 5th called Coronavirus News for Black Folks. And in it, I started a series called Essential and Black to spotlight Black essential workers because the historically white staffed media, I didn't feel like they were really showing them, right? And talking to them about their devastating experiences. And so I spoke to a Kenyan nurse who is based in Jersey, and she said, people forget, I think, sometimes that, even though we're nurses, we still cry. She said they would cry every day. And on top of that, she's a Black nurse, so she has to constantly be proving to her peers because she's a travel aide, as opposed to having like a main staff. So she would constantly have to validate herself and prove herself that she's good enough to do her job on top of taking care of people during this devastating pandemic. So there's just so many layers to it. And it doesn't only apply to Black journalists. It also applies to white journalists, right? They are not devoid of any inherent bias or any inherent bias. So I think it's interesting. All of the conversations have been around Black journalists, but I would like to also know how white journalists are being impacted and I need for them to interrogate some of their own racial bias and what they bring.
They will tell us if they're watching, if you are being impacted, you're a journalist who's white, not a Black journalist, share those thoughts with us. In the meantime, I want to go to Julia Craven. She is a reporter for Slate magazine. She told us how she uses her Blackness. Let's have a look.
My identity is why I bring a different perspective to the job. It informs how I do my work, from the stories I decide to pursue to how I interact with the people I interview. Blackness and a subsequent education on racism is simply another level of expertise that my Black peers and I bring to the job. And it allows us to do something a lot of folks in our industry historically haven't been able to do in their work, which is see Black folks as human and move our narratives forward accordingly.
Soledad?
Yeah, she makes a great point. I mean, I think there's so much value to being a journalist who is not in the mainstream, especially when the stories and the conversations are complicated, where it's not, well, this or this, but actually incredibly nuanced and complex. And even, there's no sort of Black monolith that all agrees on every topic. And so I have really found it very helpful to be able to even understands what are those conversations that are happening and how do we think about whose voice should be elevated or competing voices that need to be heard. So I think she makes a really, really good point. The other piece that I thought Patrice's op-ed was fantastic, but I think also there's the whole personal side of it too, right? I can't tell you the number of people who've taken me aside, friends who are white, and they're like, I just need to talk to you about this. And I'm like, I just can't do it. I cannot do it. I cannot help you. Said with love. You know what? I cannot do. What I cannot do is spend all day at work doing this, and then go and kind of spend some time in my personal life and have people call you and say, I just want to process this. And I think it's a compliment, right? I think it's sort of like, I feel like I need to walk through this with somebody, but it's a really terrible time to hit up your Black friend to have a conversation because your Black friend's really, really, really tired.
So Soledad, I have to share this with you. Tracy Hunt is a reporter. She's a producer at WNYC Radio in New York. And she was talking about this on Twitter and people were saying, oh, okay, I'm going to text white people and I'm going to tell them to do this and I'm going to tell them to do this and it will help them kind of work out how to talk to black people. Tracy Hunt says, I just had an idea. Instead of doing this, send your black friends a fruit and cheese basket from Harry and David's. Harry and David's is a grocery store and they have some really nice treats. So this idea of being a receptacle for as an expert on race, Quincy, I noticed, I'm actually just going to go here and look at how you describe yourself on Twitter. In your description here, you describe yourself as black. So you are saying, I am a black man. I have this expertise. But how does it inform your work? How do you think it better informs your listeners?
Yeah, so the thing is, I have black friends and I have black family. Novel idea. But, through that, I know what, people are feeling and what people want. And I think that, this kind of idea came to me at a protest I went to on Wednesday where people were calling to action, like we need to go to our city council. And so in my mind, that kind of a switch went off and said, people want to see results. So, it's sort of like taking cues from what your friends are saying, what your family are saying, and sort of using your, I guess, utility as a journalist to sort of mine for, this change that they want. So personally, for me, I've kind of been like, yes, last week was a time to chronicle this significant reckoning that we're having in America once again. But next week, it's time to start looking into, what do protesters want to find out? Me and another coworker are sort of compiling a list of things to sort of ask the Boston Police Department for, things that can kind of shed light with how they operate. And I think that, a lot of my white colleagues feel like, we all hands should be on deck for these protests. And some people are walking on eggshells about, well, maybe we should, look at other places. And it seems like everyone is very polite and nothing is getting said. And I think as a black journalist, I can step in and say, well, maybe all hands on deck. We don't need all hands on deck for a protest. Maybe somebody can spend their time looking and performing some kind of accountability journalism. So I think that's sort of, what the epiphany that I've had in the past few days.
I'm just wondering about what's going on in newsrooms around the United States, actually. And there've been some interesting thoughts on YouTube right now. Hello, Men in Black. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. The industry of journalism in the USA by itself is segregated to this day. It is a caste system from CNN to NPR. Then Men in Black goes on to say, journalism as an industry, it has a culture based on clear, segregated values. Patrice is saying yes, yes, yes. Patrice.
Yeah,
More than her. I need more.
Yeah.
Tell us about your experience.
I'm about to tell you.
You worked in mainstream journalism. I think this shows how difficult it is to have this conversation, even amongst ourselves as journalists of color, because we're so used to not saying this stuff out loud. But you worked on a mainstream media platform, and you found what there?
Well, can I ask you a question really quick?
Yeah, ask me a question, of course.
Okay, so what do you mean by mainstream?
You work for BuzzFeed.
Yeah. So I worked for BuzzFeed, right? For about 3 years. I resigned last fall. And I wrote and worked for publications that specifically targeted Black audiences. Ebony, OK Africa. I was at HuffPost as an intern. I was also an intern at CNN in America documentary unit, which Soledad obviously ran. I was in that during graduate school.
That's so great.
Yes, Jason Samuels. I was one of his students.
The
So
best, the
anyway,
best.
yeah,
So
it's funny.
let's just focus on this idea of a segregated newsroom. Patrice, did you find that? What was your experience? Because you're now freelancing and you're now
And
doing extraordinary projects like coronavirus news for Black people. So, what was your experience? What did you find in mainstream?
well, people can get a really they can find out about my experiences and some of my former Black colleagues at BuzzFeed's experience if they go to my Twitter page, because we are revealing a lot of the racist and oppressive things we experienced while working there. For example, like there was a happy hour we had, there was a noose there for some reason, and people took photos with it jokingly. Another white video producer proposed the idea of white people picking cotton for the first time for a Black History Month video. So just a lot of these instances that go again to show that newsrooms are not isolated. They're not in vacuums. They're a part of the society which is rooted in systemic racism. That's why we are seeing all these police brutality videos and these vigilante killings. We're seeing the Amy Coopers. We have Amy Coopers in the newsroom still to this day. And it's unfortunate because, you know, segregation that the user was referring to, that is the case in the newsroom. And as I said in my essay, it's pushing out a lot of very brilliant, talented, capable Black journalists who honestly don't want to endure this.
Let me just remind everybody who Amy Cooper is. She's infamous in the United States right now. She was in Central Park, and there was a bird watcher, and there was an interaction between her and the bird watcher. The bird watcher happened to be a Black man, and she called the police, and she said she was afraid for her life, but she did some extraordinary acting while she was doing that. That is that story that contributes to the kind of the mood right now. Soledad, I'm looking at where do we go from here. On your Twitter banner, you are described as boss lady. You are a woman of color. You are a journalist of color. I wonder if this is the solution, boss lady. Are we talking about who controls the news, the narrative, how the stories are shared? Maybe if there were more people of color in newsrooms, then maybe Quincy wouldn't have to do that little dance around. This is an important story. Where do we go, etc., etc. Boss
Yeah,
lady,
it's a
tell us.
process. I don't think in the short term, Quincy is going to continue to do that in the short term, and Patrice will continue to push back and talk about her experiences in other newsrooms because that's where we are. So I'm not particularly Pollyanna about results coming anytime soon. But two things I'd like to add to what Patrice said that I thought was excellent. Segregated newsrooms, I think, in a couple of ways. When I was working at CNN, I'm so excited that Patrice worked on my our big project. It was a big doc unit. I feel really old, but also I'm very excited that we got to be part of the start of your career. I love it.
It was amazing. I love Black in America.
But it was so interesting. And you when you said that, you reminded me that some of the segregation is when you start working on projects that are going to be focusing on people of color. So that In America unit did Black in America, Latino in America, gay in America, Muslim in America, et cetera, et cetera. So when you start doing that, you appeal to people who are like, oh my God, finally, I'm going to have a chance to tell some of these stories that I've wanted to tell. And so you do, in some ways, have this segregated, unit of people, lots of people of color in this unit. But the other piece of it is that unit is expected to be diverse. And I used to have this argument at CNN all the time. And it's really easy to talk about now that I'm not there, which is, the expectation was that I would have a diverse team, but nobody else was expected to. In fact, people would brag about my diverse team, right? And I would go to diversity events and be the diverse face of CNN. But, people would say, Soledad's team is, 60% people of color, whatever. But when it can, even when I did a morning show, yes. Can you hear me still? Did I drop you?
Yeah, no, we hear you. We're right at the end of this show. This is a conversation that has been going on for decades. What is your final thought in our last 30 seconds?
More decades. This is a conversation that's going to go on for more decades. I wish I could say something more hopeful, but no.
Patrice, how hopeful are you as a final thought?
I'm hopeful. We just got to keep this same energy that these protesters have out here. But I'm hopeful because this is not the first time Black people and Black journalists have been in this situation. So we're going to keep
And
on keeping on.
Quincy, the diplomat, final thought.
I'd say I'm a pragmatist. Yesterday, I spoke to someone who said, I was protesting during, Rodney King. And so, that was almost 30 years ago. And, here we are. And where were we 30 years before that?
Yeah.
And, I just say, people often say, look to history as a guide. And what has history shown us? But, incremental progress, sort of quasi progress. But I hope this time is different. A lot of people are out in the streets during a deadly pandemic, and that's sort of unprecedented. So maybe that counts for something.
Quincy, Patrice, Soledad, thank you for sharing your experiences as Black journalists covering the George Floyd protests, existing as journalists of color in this era right now. Really appreciate you. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time.